On June 23rd this year, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in favor of deporting illegal migrants to countries that are not their homelands, that is, to third countries. In doing so, it overturned a lower court ruling that required the government to give the deportees a meaningful opportunity to establish that the deportation would put them at risk of torture. Also in June, the New York Times reported that the U.S. has sought to enter into third-country deportation arrangements with at least 58 countries to which the worst of criminals apprehended on American soil would be sent. 7 countries are known to have accepted these deportations as of June 25. They include Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Kosovo, Mexico, Panama, and Rwanda. South Sudan and Eswatini were added to the list in July. Beyond the significant concerns about the safety and well-being of individuals being deported to countries that they may not be familiar with, potentially exposing them to harm, our focus in today's conversation is a better understanding of third-country deportation in international law and what the important questions are for Africa in discussing these deportations and the general human rights implications as raised by the United Nations experts. I have 3 guests for this conversation. The first is founder and CEO, Lago Collective, a research and creative collective on migration, culture, and the arts. She joins us from London. Marta Foresti, thank you very much for being here. We also have legal practitioner, Liborous Oshoma, and director, African Center for the Study of the U.S., University of Pretoria, Christopher Isike. Gentlemen, thank you very much for giving us your time. All right, I will start with you, Liborous, and just ask that you give us an explanation of what third-country deportation means and your response to debates whether it is legal in international law.
Yeah, thank you. If you can hear me, and my pleasure being here again. Third-party deportation is deportation of criminals to countries that are not their country of origin. And it is a debate also whether it is legal in international law or not, because ordinarily the reason for third-party deportation is to prevent their inhuman treatment to them if deported to their country of origin. For example, that if you're deported to your country of origin, that the treatment that will be meted out to the prisoner, will be inhuman, will be worse than if he had served, sentence in a country where these crimes are committed. But unfortunately, the way it is being used by the U.S. has serially, not met the essence and aim of third-party deportation. It is, and that's why it is being viewed as very illegal now. And some countries that have accepted, this third-party deportation are really not doing so, willy-nilly. In some cases, they are coerced to doing it, and in some other cases, fruits are dangled. Permit me to use the word. They are fruits of a form of visa aids and financial aid that dangled before them, and for them to accept this third-party deportation. And the President of America once did say that most of these people who are deported to these countries committed crimes like rape, child abuse and all of that. And so the perception for, some African countries is that these countries viewed Africans and these countries that they are sending prisoners to as worse, that they are prisons, and so go suffer in these places. And, mind you, most of these countries also have their own challenges, and the issues are not too clear. And that's why largely, it is debatable. The legality otherwise of it at the international law is debatable.
Yeah, you do have a point when you say that fruits are dangled. We know that for a fact, even though most of the countries like Eswatini have said that they cannot share the information as to details of the arrangement. We'll try and explore that later. But Marta, I want you to talk to us about, bearing in mind, of course, the principle of non-refoulement in international law. I hope I got that word correctly. What are some of the problems with... Okay, I'll leave that question for Christopher. Let me ask you rather what your understanding of the U.S. government's resort to third country deportation means.
Let me try to answer that question with a reflection on what the US government is failing to do, which is to learn lessons from previous attempts of very similar approaches that have fundamentally failed, most recently in Europe, and most recently I'm thinking at the very, very often referred to Rwanda deal that the UK government, the previous UK government, Conservative government, wanted to achieve and made a big priority of. And let me think about a couple of lessons learned from that experience. First of all, that was an even broader deportation, and in fact, it was not framed as deportation because, in fact, it affected potentially everybody who attempted to arrive to the UK on a small boat, therefore illegally, in inverted commas, that they would be automatically sent to Rwanda, and that there was a deal struck by the UK and the Rwandan government on Rwanda then processing the individual cases and in case welcome those who had a case for claiming asylum. Now, one of the most interesting thing about this Rwanda deal is that it never happened. We had the Home Secretary saying her dream was to see this plane take off from Heathrow Airport full of people that enter the countries illegally and set off for Rwanda, and not a single flight has ever taken off. And the reason why I mention this is because this is directly related to what we just heard about the legal challenges and the legal, the very shaky legal grounds for these agreements, that they're resulting to actual challenges for cases, which means that certainly in the UK, this has translated into this idea and this deal remaining an idea and a deal and never becoming an actual flight of people leaving the country. Why this matters beyond the fact that now we have a new government that has, that has immediately said they were not going to pursue this particular deal, but continued on the same tradition of trying to find ways to deport illegal migrants. But the reason why this is a problem in relation to third countries is that the whole premise of these deals and these sort of third country deportation flights is that they will act as a deterrent. So when people see these flights full of illegal migrants taking off and being sent to Rwanda, people will stop trying to come to this country through illegal means. The fact that these flights don't happen, in part because of some of the legal challenges that are associated with it, means that that deterrence simply doesn't take place, and it remains an idea that if people really, felt that they were at risk of being deported to Rwanda, then surely people will not come to this country. But guess what? People are not deported to Rwanda, and I suspect that this will be equally challenging to put in place in the US, and therefore the whole premise of this being an effective deterrence falls to pieces.
Okay.
Which then leads. Let me just finish a second to say that the real problem with these deals is that they cost a phenomenal amount of money and they achieve absolutely nothing. So you have an illegal or a legally shaky deal that costs a lot of money that ends up undermining international relations and lack of respect for third country partners, and that becomes basically a failure all around.
You just took the question right out of my mouth. I was going to ask you about the deterrent factor, if it is actually working and what data says. But you might want to chip in on that a little later. Let me bring in Christopher and just ask, bearing in mind, that was the question I originally put up. Bearing in mind the principle of non-refoulement, I don't know if I pronounced that word correctly, in international law, what are some of the problems with these third country deportations?
Well, thank you for having me. For me, look, it starts also with the ontological basis of bringing them to Africa. So these are not just illegal immigrants that are being deported now. In this case, they are deplorables, criminals, the worst of the worst, people who have committed all kinds of crimes that the United States deemed unworthy to keep in the United States. So the question ontologically is, where else should they go, and why Africa? That's something that we need to also, look at. In terms of the non-refoulement obligations that the US does have, that it is not looking at, even though it is not a signatory to a lot of in international conventions, the US is a signatory to the Convention Against Torture, which prohibits transferring anyone to a state where they are at risk of torture, regardless of their refugee status, right, or immigration status. That is something that is not being looked at, is not being considered right now, especially in the cases of those people that were sent to Eswatini, in former Swaziland. They were kept in containers in Djibouti before they were eventually transferred to Eswatini, and their rights are being denied. So it appears that the reason for selecting some of these countries, apart from the carrots that was dangled before some of them, is the fact that these countries, like the one in South Sudan or even Eswatini, have little regard for human rights and little regard for transparency and accountability in governance. And it speaks volumes about how Africa is viewed, especially by this president, even though we know that he views Africa in very derogatory terms. The fact that it's actually implementing and we're cahoots with it, with the US government in this is actually, concerning.
All right, Liborous, I have quite a mouthful for you, but I clustered them together because they're related. What kind of legal status will these deported criminal in quotes, migrants have in their new location? Will they be subject to the laws of the new land or that of the country that they are being moved from? What happens after they finish serving their time?
Yeah, that's thank you. That's one of the reasons why the UK deal with Rwanda didn't take off, because if you remember, some of the receiver countries also had said that they are truly not ready to disclose, the content of this deal, because now one of the major reasons is, for how long are they going to serve, term in these countries? Is it during the duration of their prison term? And after service, what happens to them? And mind you, they are not originally from this country. What status are they going to be taking on when they get to these countries? Is it the status of a prisoner, the status of a resident in that country, or the status of a visitor? So these are some of the issues that are properly not tidied up. And then, like my colleague also said there just now about human rights, and hold human rights violation in highest esteem. And then you now look for places where you can send prisoners to, where their rights can be abused and violated. And then you are not even certain what status, these prisoners will take, whether they would, because certainly this country is not going to accept them as citizens. They are not going to accept them as residents. They are not going to accept them permanently in this country, even after the term of their prison. So, and that's why the international community and the United Nations is kicking against it. And this was one of the reasons. Remember even the US deal, UK Rwanda deal was challenged in the US court, and that the court eventually ruled against it. And so these are so many questions that are not tidied up. And like I said, essentially the reason for all of this was to ensure the protection of persons who ordinarily, if sent to their country, of origin would, whose rights would be abused. But a situation where countries are now countries are now twisted with visa restrictions, just like the case of the vice president of Sudan, and then the case of Nigeria, being compared to accept prisoners from Venezuela and all of those things, and they are twisted and visa restrictions are placed on them. It is no longer about the case, a case of not defilement. It's a case of, the U.S., pushing whatever they feel that they want to do and then shoving it down the throat of African countries.
All right, let me interject.
Things that they also know that they cannot.
Yeah, I'm trying to interject and follow up on the thoughts you just raised. Countries like Nigeria, for instance, in the case of the Venezuelans being brought back, have rejected. So we have our own problems. That's what the minister said. What are the consequences or the downside to this, show of, some would describe, strength?
Like Nigeria, because of its size and because of its place in the black world, permit me to use the word black Africa, West Africa also, Nigeria has played a very dominant role in stabilizing West Africa. And that is why it is very easy for Nigeria to some extent stand its ground. But, other countries like, South Sudan that I mentioned couldn't really stand their ground also because they don't have that kind of stability that Nigeria enjoys. And, smaller countries also will not be able to, have create that kind of pushback that Nigeria is pushing. But, even the recent visa restrictions, to 3 months visa restrictions placed on Nigerian, visitors to U.S. Also, the backlash is back here. A lot of people are debating it. Whether it is as a result of prisoners that were supposedly to be sent to Nigeria.
Right.
So the place of Nigeria in African politics and West Africa is not something that you can underrate. That's why they are able to have that kind of pushback. It is not every country that enjoys that kind of dominance and strength that will be able to have that kind of pushback. And so that's why it is not enough also for the international community to just raise concern. It's not enough for the UN to raise concern. It is also the courts in America also are not doing enough. I think they're playing more politics with it than actually being independent and looking at it independently. So,
let me give some talk time to Marta. I want you to write off what Christopher highlighted, concerns over human rights. UN human rights experts have also sounded the alarm about the implications here of not just the U.S. Supreme Court ruling, but for every other country that's considering this third world deportation. Talk to us about these human rights concerns and why it is important.
So there are a couple of ways to think about this, and generally the conditions and the premises for some of these deals. Some, as colleagues have just highlighted, is concerns over the human rights treatment of people at the receiving end, and the extent to which countries that are meant to host and accommodate people who are being deported can fulfill their obligations. And this has been, in the case of the UK Rwanda deal, which I want to keep making reference to because it's such an interesting case of something to learn from in terms of what's feasible. It was definitely the area that was the base of much of the legal challenges that it was not realistic, it was not persuasive that Rwanda could guarantee the treatment of some of the deportees in a way that will be consistent and respectful of international law. But the other important aspects of human rights is that we often think about the conditions of the individual's migrants or the individual deportee. And I know, as far as I understand, in the US, the debate is also about the human rights of those who are incarcerated and whether this deportation is being assessed correctly in terms of what people are entitled to, and if I understand correctly, even cases where people have been returned to the US because the courts have ruled that the deportation was illegal. But the other aspect of human rights is not just about the the implications for the individuals, but the implications for international relations, because the premise of international law and human rights law is reciprocal and, collaborative nature and reciprocal grounds. And what is particularly striking about the way in which the US is going about these deals, and I'm glad that colleagues have brought up the issues of visa restrictions, is that it completely falls short of respecting the reciprocity aspect of this dynamic. So on the one hand, you want countries to collaborate with you when it comes to either receiving deported criminal or illegal migrants, or is simply taking back illegal migrants. But on the other hand, you apply sanctions on something like, normal visas, so for perfectly legal kind of migration. And literally in diplomacy, you can't have it both ways. You can't have it that you're on the one hand punish countries and
Marta, I'm sorry to interject. I'm just looking at the time now. We have barely 5 minutes to conclude this conversation. And Christopher, I'd really like your thoughts here on what is being said. One professor said that even if international law has been violated, the U.S. is unlikely to face consequences as it does not recognize many international courts. Is this correct? And what are the likely implications to consider?
For the US, you mean?
Yes, for the US. They don't seem to. Do you get the question?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Look, legally, the US can deport criminal non-citizens to third countries, like we've all seemed to agreed on. And that is if they have no viable national destination, or if they feel that they are going back to their countries who violate the Convention Against Torture or Due Process in those countries. But the way that the US has done this, the expedited nature, its unilateral application and the absence of any kind of notice has raised a lot of, constitutional legality within the US itself, but also internationally. Now, to your question of what repercussions it will have for the US, unfortunately not in an era where the US is acting like a bully, in an era where the US is, going against all known international norms, especially the ones that it contributed to creating. There will be no repercussions because no country, very few countries are able to stand up to the US that uses tariffs as an instrument to coerce countries to do their bidding. So the simple answer is that there will be no implications beyond the soft power reputation of the US that it will harm.
I want to stay with you and ask about an offshoot of Nigeria, for instance, not playing ball and saying we have our own problems, we can take in more. But not so with countries like Rwanda, Eswatini, South Sudan, and the likes. So what is it that is compelling these African nations to accept these conditions that people say it's mostly inhuman? What can they do to stop accepting these agreements? Or is it that the fact that it is legal, does it make it okay?
Yeah, that's why I raised the ontological question of why Africa would even consider those in the first place, because these are, for lack of a better word, deplorables that the US feel unworthy to stay in their country. So why does the US think that they'll be worthy to stay in Africa? Well, they can think so for their own selfish reasons, but the responsibility and the onus is on us to ask that basic ontological question. Would they send these criminals to England, for example? Would they send them to Canada? Would they send them to Western Europe? They wouldn't even consider it. Why? Are they more humans? Are they better humans? Are we less humans? These are some of the ontological questions that we as Africans must begin to ask. And I'm pleasantly surprised at how the Nigerian government, refused this. In the Rwandan case, we know that there was a lot of benefit in terms of finance, money that the Rwandan government would have got to, so they actively sought it, right? In this case, they are being forced, and some of these states are being threatened. And when they refuse, like the Nigerian case, the same for South Africa also, then they get punishment and considering that some of these countries like Nigeria and South Africa are also members of BRICS, there will be more punishment coming from them in terms of the perceived support for de-dollarization. But at the end of the day, it is unfortunate that these are the kind of things that are forced on the continent, and it is the responsibility of these African countries, irrespective of whatever financial benefits they'll get from this, to push back on it, because there are also security implications for these countries. The sad part of all of this is that we do not know for sure. These deals are still couched in secrecy. None of the third countries or the US has been able to release the terms of agreements with these countries. So we do not know if many of these criminals, if they've served their term, because in some instances we've heard that some of them have completed their terms in the US, whether they will stay in these countries as holding countries until they are sent back to their original countries. We do not know, so we can only speculate. But at the end of the day, these are bad people that should not stay in our continent, no matter how porous or weak our governments or our borders are.
All right. Liborous, I'll come to you about, compelling full disclosure. But before that, let me ask Marta her thoughts on this. What role can African nations play in shaping international response to this issue of third country deportations?
Could play a pivotal role in reinforcing the absolutely essential reciprocal nature of these relationships. So whether it is standing ground on something they don't want to accept, or negotiating terms that are more consistent and convenient for their priorities. Let me give you a very concrete example. It's not as if the UK government has given up the attempt to deport illegal migrants. And as of today, the Prime Minister has announced a new deal with France, where for each illegal migrants that comes to the UK that the UK wants to return to France, the UK commits to take one back through channels of legal migration. Now, there are all sorts of debates about whether this is also going to work, but fundamentally, this is a reciprocal arrangement between two partners of equal. And colleagues were saying here the assumption is that is the treatment from the US towards African countries as of sort of second nature and not respectful and not equal partners. So African nations should insist on equal partnerships where the terms are negotiated on equal grounds.
All right, Liborous, I wanted to ask you about something Christopher said on, not knowing the full content of the arrangements and agreements deals that are signed by these African countries with either the US or the UK. So is there perhaps some legal maneuver that can be taken to compel these countries to disclose to citizens the details of this arrangement so that they know if it is detrimental to the well-being of their individual countries?
The citizens of such countries, like in Nigeria, for example, where you have the Freedom of Information Act, such laws can be explored to compel, these countries to open up on them or to disclose the source of, such agreement. But in most cases, because these agreements are not domiciled, they are not domiciled by virtue of the domestic laws of these countries. They are international arrangements and deals. It becomes very difficult for even the government, even when you assess, for example, using the case of the Freedom of Information Act, to assess those information, it becomes very difficult for the full disclosure of the content of those information. And but one thing that both Christopher, Marta, and I have agreed here today is that these deals are detrimental. They are not reciprocal to the international laws, of the receiving countries. And so what can, the countries do? I think it is high time now African countries need to also up the ante. They are negotiating from a position of weakness. No matter the amount of foreign aid, for example, that Rwanda is going to receive, it will not be equal to the detriment or the disaster that some of these dangerous criminals can then, the havoc that can be wreaked on the society. We're still talking about, in Nigeria, we're talking about insecurity, militancy, terrorism, and what have you. So now imagine that you have criminals who are terrorists and that are sent from America or sent from, what do you call it, sent from America to Nigeria. You imagine the danger, the inherent danger that would cause. So the best thing for African countries, especially West Africa and Nigeria, and I'm sorry, quickly, I'm running up. So quite quickly, what they can do is to ensure that this is the time for them to begin to look inward, and then also provide the basic and social amenities for their country, so that people that are going illegally into these countries will not be treated like animals instead of being treated, given an equal right like they give to their citizens there. The time to provide the necessary amenities in Africa is now, so that people, we can also negotiate from that, strength.
Okay. In 30 seconds, Christopher, is there something you'd like to add?
That's an opportunity, that pedestal.
Okay. Christopher, in 30 seconds.
Yeah, maybe I'll just piggyback on what Liborous was saying about Africa using this opportunity now with the kind of pushback they're getting from the Trump administration to really rethink its state systems. We need to rethink our state systems, our governance systems, and begin to look inward to remake our state to be better. And in doing so, we should consider, coming together as a continent and having a consensus, a common African position on how to relate and engage with superpowers in our continent.
Marta, in 30 seconds, if you can, your thoughts, final thoughts about this third country deportation policy. Okay, I think your device is muted. We can't hear you.
Sorry. My 2 cents is that they don't work, so we should start trying to do them. They don't, they cause a lot of pain, they cost a lot of money, they don't act as deterrents.
All right, thank you, Marta. Liborous, thank you so much. And of course, Christopher, it's been a pleasure having you all. Thank you for your time.